change adaptation on the South Australian coast, the policies and the science behind them. And we're pretty well on track. So I'll leave it to Murray now.
Thanks, Michelle. I'd like to thank the organisers too for making me the last obstacle between people and drinks. So I can also assure you that you're unlikely to be thirstier than I am. So I'm going to have to get through this fairly quickly. So briefly, just going to get the wordy stuff out of the way first, boring bits really. About the Coast Protection Board, which is the statutory authority in South Australia for managing the coast. Going to talk about a subset of the policy, which is around sea level rise, and then going to have a few slides on local impacts and some of the lessons we've had from implementing a policy that's now been around 25 years. So the board itself has been around since 1972. The legislation came in after an extended stormy period in southern Australia, which lots of states created coastal authorities to try and manage the problems that were occurring. Coast Protection Board is pretty much the last one standing across the country. We've also got the board also has some powers to control development in South Australia, as well as just looking purely at coastal management. And there's a unit in GENA that provides the technical and admin support. And by technical, I mean it's a group that has scientists, engineers, planners and surveyors all working together to support the board and implement its policies, amongst other duties. Briefly, strategic direction, there shouldn't be any real surprises here, but given the era that the Act came in and the issues at the time, there's a lot of focus on development, but it's a nice Act in many ways. One is that it's fairly short, and secondly that it's fairly broad. So the board can pick up on a lot of issues outside what might have been the initial explicit intent. So it can pick up, and does pick up, on ecological issues as well. And as hinted in some of the earlier presentations around the coastal impacts of climate change, there are sensitivities around certain coastal ecosystems, particularly those that are tide dependent. Now, I'm not really going to be talking about those today. I'm going to focus on the development, which is maybe looking at the planet's revenge for climate change in the first place. Now, I mentioned that we've had a policy incorporating sea level rise for 25 years. So this policy was approved by the South Australian Government in 1991, which made South Australia the first state to have, an Australian state to have any policy incorporating climate change factors. These policies were inserted into the planning system in 1994, where they still exist, with considerable maintenance and upkeep, I must say. The sea level rise allowances in that policy were based on what was then the first assessment of the IPCC, or in fact a preliminary report of the first assessment of the IPCC. In brief, coastal development's got to factor in 30 centimetres of sea level rise up front. That's not that far. That amount of sea level rise based on the 1990 baseline isn't all that far away. Nominally 2050 was the thinking at the time, and so far we're pretty much on track for that. Reflecting the increased uncertainties as time goes on, a further allowance for 0.7 metres of sea level rise should be considered in how do you protect the development against that in the future. And that the end date for that was nominally 2100. Of course, flooding isn't the only problem. There's erosion issues as well, and the same factors apply when trying to calculate erosion buffers and setbacks, or erosion protection. The other statement that highlighted in the policy here is it says major developments must consider the full range of possible sea level rise scenarios. First lesson in implementing this policy, that statement is sufficiently vague to cause us no end of grief when it comes to looking at major developments. For God's sake, if you're going to develop a policy, make it clear. Now, the latest IPCC assessment was the 5th, you're probably all aware of. The key findings for sea level rise out of that are there. I'm not going to go through them all. But for the high emissions, I'll just point out that they're looking close to a metre of sea level rise by the end of the century. And because of the incredible inertia in the oceans and the ice sheets, glaciers, etc., we're still looking at significant sea level rise even if we do a hell of a lot about emissions. Going way back in time, just a quick slide showing how sea levels fluctuated over the last nearly 500,000 years, down to about 140, 150 metres below current levels at different times. Focusing in on that part of it, the last 20,000 years, it's come up about 5 metres, which had stayed stable for some thousands of years. Be aware with this chart, of course, that the scale on the bottom is incredibly dodgy, so don't be fooled into thinking it's linear. And yeah, the projections I'll just go into now. So the first assessment, somewhere over a metre in the worst case, including all uncertainties. Their best estimate, some 0.6, 0.7 of a metre. Second assessment wasn't all that much different, really. They'd done some improvements in the modelling. The third, they'd invented colour printers. But you notice they dropped the scale back as well. And it's interesting that the sea level rise projections got a bit lower at roughly about the same period of time that the serious denialist movement cranked up. Now, why that is, I couldn't possibly say. I'm talking about correlation, not cause and effect. Fourth assessment, not that much different from the third. I'll just point out that that's where measured sea level rise was at Port Stanvac, just south of Adelaide, back in 2009, compared with the projections. And the fifth assessment, once again the scale's all different, particularly the x-axis, because it goes back to 1700, but potentially the upper limit's around a metre, possibly higher, depending on their uncertainties. And even with the low emission scenarios, you're still seeing that incredible inertia that's in the system. Going out beyond 2100 though, a couple of people have done some good work on that. Rahmsdorf in the last decade did a fair bit, Stefan Rahmsdorf, but the couple of European countries like the Netherlands, who have got some serious issues to deal with, about a third of their countries below sea level now, so they've obviously got a keen interest on where sea level's going to go, went out to about 2250, and the Germans, who themselves have a fair bit of low-lying land up in the northern part of the country, gone out another 100 years, and a fair bit of hand-waving here, but potentially more than 2 metres, possibly up to 5 metres. Someone did suggest today that I start talking about frightening scenarios of 5 to 10 metres of sea level rise, but that's not in our policy. What's happening with sea level? This is measurements taken off the University of Colorado site last week from satellite data. Trends, global average is about 3.3 mil a year, plus or minus of course. And just to point out that little bit there, you've got a drop there of about 6 mil. That was all the rain that got dumped on southeastern Australia during the events that caused the Brisbane floods and the Lockyer Valley floods. That took enough water out of the oceans and dumped it on land to drop sea level by 6 millimetres. In South Australia, the average in South Australia is a bit lower than the global mean. Luckily, we've got the base here for the National Tidal Centre, part of the Bureau of Meteorology. They've been measuring sea levels since the early 90s around the place, and that's a subset of their data. So there's were two gauges in South Australia, one at Thevenard. There was one at Port Stanvac until 2010 when they started pulling apart the jetty there, so they pulled the gauge out at the same time, unfortunately. But above the global average, but nothing like some of the frightening numbers they're getting up in the northern part of the country in Southeast Asia, or Southern Asia. What does it mean, sea level rise? So here's a picture from Inner Harbour at Port Adelaide a few years ago, just a moderate storm. Not all that much freeboard between the water level and the floor of those houses. These houses were built in accord with board policy, so they allow for the 0.3. But what happens is you've got a present risk curve, so average recurrence interval of a storm along the x-axis, water level up the top. What's an event you might expect to occur once every 100 years, or 1% chance of it occurring in any given year? Add 30 centimetres of sea level rise, you might get that event occurring every 5 years, or that water level being reached every 5 years. And this is assuming that the intensity and frequency of storms doesn't change, that we've got exactly the same climatic conditions, just with a higher mean sea level underlying the storm surge. So I'm not saying you're going to get more intense storm events, just that the effect of storms is going to be more severe. So some detailed flood mapping of Port Adelaide. There's the middle of Port Adelaide, well over a metre of water, with a 100-year ARI storm, or a 1% storm, only half a metre of sea level rise. An additional complication for Port Adelaide is this bit. They last measured they were subsiding about 2 millimetres a year, which just makes everything better. Comparing what average sea level might look like, that's mean sea level at North Glenelg in 2009 with a perfectly adequate seawall. An adequate seawall doesn't mean it doesn't get overtopped, it just means it doesn't fail, even when it does get overtopped. Add a metre of sea level to that, and that's your baseline for any storm surge or tidal effects. The seawall's not adequate for that situation at this stage. If you wanted to prevent overtopping back here, you'd probably have to raise the seawall by 2 metres. No one's going to put up with raising a seawall by 3 metres currently. Whether their attitude will change 50, 100 years down the track remains to be seen. How do we apply it? Just a couple of quick slides. So of course one of the options for flooding is protection rather than retreat. This is the sort of thing that leads to some of the problems that previous people were talking about, which is crowding out your coastal ecosystems. And erosion buffers. This is an example of how the Brunneril works on a sandy coast. This, however, is how just erosion works on a rocky coast down at Robe. This is completely fenced off now because it's too unsafe to get to. Could go in any time. A couple of quick lessons. Initially, the policy said that in all situations you have to have the site level and then raise a floor level for a bit of freeboard above that. That causes a few problems, and this is one of them. There's a house there that's been there for donkey's years. This is at Fisherman's Bay near Port Broughton. You had enough fill to make that house meet the board's policies. You've got an enormous amount of fill, plus an incredible difference in the township. If water does flood in and it floods back around, it can be accelerated by all that stuff. It can cause problems on adjacent properties. Can we find enough fill in the future to keep doing it this way? In some circumstances, we've now modified the policy to look at, well, in an area where you're not going to be able to protect the whole township anyway. For example, a place called Cowlard's Landing. It's got less than a dozen shacks, I reckon, just south of Whyalla on the Spencer Gulf. Do we let them keep the low site level and just raise the place up to deal with it? And yes, that is intertidal salt marsh sitting around these houses, and that is there for sale sign for that shack. Yeah. Last one I'm going to show you is where you've got levee protection anyway. Most people worry about what's going to come over the top, which is fair enough if you've got an inadequate levee, but even if you've got an adequate one, sea level comes up. In many cases, so does your groundwater in response. So you've got to look down and see what's going to come up through your soils and flood your settlement anyway. Port Pirie suffers from this to some degree already. Another settlement around the corner called Port Germain, previously dry cellars, currently wet cellars, and a bit of a problem in the cemetery as well at the moment. So in the future, as I mentioned earlier, this is my last slide by the way, Michelle. Development of human societies did occur during that 6,000 period of stable sea level rise, and we're not going to have that for a long time to come. We've got a lot of very exposed communities, not just in South Australia. This is a drop in the bucket compared with the global situation. And so how do we resource providing protection, or do we not provide protection? Do we have alternatives? In the current social and political situation, I don't think they're quite ready to go there. As one of the other speakers said, you wait for the event and have your policies ready to go. That might be what we have to do. Do we have to look more at minimising the occurrence of emergencies rather than just responding to them? And how far in the future should we plan? Don't necessarily have answers to these questions, but we're going to be talking about it for a long time. Thanks.
Thank you, Murray. We'll take some questions now. Philippa?
I see there's some recent papers that have come out suggesting that some of the modelling might not be correct, and the one I looked at is that also it's 9 metres to 100 years.
Yeah.
I was wondering to ask them how much the data that's not the only one I've seen sort of going in that direction.
No, I've seen a few in the last probably month or two that have huge differences compared with the IPCC's projections. It's really hard to know how reactive to be to this stuff. 10 years ago, there were lots of papers talking about sea level rise being well in excess of 1.5 to 2 metres by the end of the century. Then it came back again. We've got this latest information based on better ice sheet research that's saying even higher again. But yeah, from a policy perspective, we can't jump every time someone comes up with a new paper. So we keep an eye on this, but realistically, we'll see what the IPCC comes up with next time and have another look at it then. We do have a look every time a new assessment report comes out. But luckily we haven't been too reactive, because over that 25 years we've pretty much come back to where we started anyway. So it's a bit hard to know what to do about it immediately.
Yeah. We got any other questions? Gentleman in the grey?
Do you get a sense that there's much sort of innovation globally in sort of coastal sea level rise, storm surge mitigation sort of tactics, or is it pretty much just you put up the seawall and that's it?
No, there are a number of ways you can deal with it. For example, after the Superstorm Sandy in the east coast of the US, that's focused a lot of attention on restoring previously wiped out reef systems around cities to break up the wave climate and